The extraordinarily brave Israeli woman sitting next to me is Robbie Damelin. Now, Robbie is a native South African. She and her family were active in the anti-apartheid movement. In fact, her uncle defended Nelson Mandela when he was accused of treason. And in 1967, Robbie immigrated to Israel, where she volunteered in a kibbutz. And over time, she became a successful businesswoman in Tel Aviv. But after a Palestinian sniper killed her son, she lost interest in her enterprise and she closed it. She could have become bitter and full of hate. And no one would have blamed her if she had. Instead, she turned her pain into a crusade for peace. And I'm so honored to have her sitting here this evening.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. So, Robbie, tell me about your son, David.
Oh, David was a student at Tel Aviv University. He was studying for his master's in the philosophy of education. And he was part of the peace movement. And he was part of the student uprising. He was actually a leader. And he was teaching philosophy to young kids who were social changers. He liked whiskey. So every year when we go to the cemetery on the day of his death, we drink a toast to David because he was a human being, you know? And for many people, when they die, become an endless hero. But he was this wonderful little star that came, played wonderful music, loved, and was so kind and loved animals just like me. And we used to wash dogs every Saturday at the animal shelter so that we could sell them afterwards. I'm very good at making dogs look fancy.
Well, tell me about the circumstances of David's death.
Well, David was called to go to the reserves, as all young Israelis are, and he was in a real quandary. You know, I keep saying this to people, you don't know who the person is behind the gun. And when he was called to go to reserves, he came to talk to me. And he said, Emma, I don't know what to do. If I don't go, what will happen to my students? They were going to be inducted into the army. He didn't want to serve in the occupied territories. And if I don't go, what will happen to my soldiers? Because he was the officer. And if I do go, then I will treat people with dignity, and so will all my soldiers. So I told you, you don't know who that person is, and you don't know what a quandary it is for a young Israeli man with that kind of background. And I only discovered about 3 years after he was killed by a Palestinian sniper, I was giving a talk, and a Palestinian man was sitting in the audience, and he kept looking at me. And I knew he wanted to say something, but he didn't know how to. And afterwards, I said, what? And he said, I want to tell you that the day before your son was killed, I drove through that checkpoint. And this beautiful young man came to talk to me. And he said, look, I'm sorry, I have to check your papers. It's my duty. It's like paying income tax. And I'll do it as quickly as I can. And then they began a conversation. And he said, you know, this Palestinian man said, you know, the next day when I heard your son had been killed, I was so sorry. And you see, that's when you see the humanity in the other, that's the beginning of the end of conflict.
How did you learn? How did you learn of David's death?
Well, I don't know, I had a kind of premonition, I guess. I got up firstly I cleaned my house. That's a really unusual thing for me. And I got up very, very early the next morning and went to my office because I didn't want to be at home. You know, there's a whole story that David Grossman wrote about this mother that runs away because she doesn't want to get the news. And I went to my office and I just couldn't concentrate or do anything. I was walking up and down, and then the knock on the door came. And nobody has to tell you when you see 3 soldiers. And apparently, and this I don't know, the first thing I said was, "You may not kill anybody in the name of my child." I didn't remember that, somebody told me. And of course, that's the beginning of a completely different life, you know?
But you know, Robbie, so most people would just feel so much rage and such desire for revenge. What was different about you? Did you go through that first before you came to some kind of a desire?
No, I think that South Africa was a big influence on me, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I understood very early that this man didn't kill David because he was David. If he had known him, he could never have done that. How could he? He just would have had to sit down with David and talk to him and understand who David was. And so there was no element of revenge. After I wrote the first letter to the family of the sniper, that was when I became free, because I gave up being a victim. And then I could really start to work and to do the things that I was doing within the parent circle, which is 600 families.
Well, tell me, though, when you decided to reach out to the family, what happened? I mean, you wrote the letter to the family. Did they respond? Did they feel as you...
Well, after David was killed, I met a religious man who invited me to come to a weekend in East Jerusalem to meet other bereaved parents, Palestinian and Israeli. And when I looked into the eyes of the Palestinian mothers, I recognized that we shared the same pain. And I recognized that if we could be together, and I'm hoping that you'll sense this when Bushra comes onto the stage, how extraordinary it is to have a partner like that, and how powerful, because it's not what you expect. But of course, I then started to travel all around the world and thought I was a really big deal, you know, and that I could convince everybody. And I came back, and there was another knock on my door, and it was the army, and they came to tell me that they caught the man who killed David. And then that was when it really became difficult, because that's the test, you know, do I really mean what I say? You can say a lot of things like peace, shalom, salam, all of these lovely words trip off your tongue. But do you mean it? And that's when, after many sleepless nights, I wrote a letter to the family of the sniper explaining who I am and who David was and the work of the Parents Circle. And I asked if maybe one day we could meet. We owed it to our children and grandchildren. And that was really the beginning of this whole long exploration of whether one can actually get to the point of not forgiving, of letting go of this, of closure. I don't easily use the word forgiving because I don't know what it means. I have a wonderful friend in South Africa who lost a daughter, and she said, forgiving is giving up your just right to revenge. And that really spoke to me. But
So did the family respond? Were they willing to reach back?
it took, when they got the letter, they were very shocked, as you can imagine. But they'd promised to give it to their son, but they never did. But I didn't understand the culture of how they were dependent on the whole village, and if they took a step like that, it could be dangerous for them. And then a young lady from our organization who'd lost a Palestinian lawyer, she'd lost her grandmother and her brother. She went into the jail and gave Thaya the letter. And of course, he was stunned. And he said, I'll write back to her. And me, being the bulldozer that I am, rushed off the next morning to the post office, but, you know, it took 2.5 years. There is no such thing as instant reconciliation. You know, we all expect it all to happen immediately. And it took a while, and then I got a letter back, which was hardly a letter from Martin Luther King.
So tell us about the letter, because you really were obviously hoping he would write and say, I also feel these feelings of reconciliation. But that's not what he did, right?
Not at all. But the good thing is that once I'd written the initial letter, I was no longer a victim of this man. So he could do what he liked, and my life is not dependent on what he does. What I do is what I do, and what he does is, it would be nice if he realized that you can never free any country by killing, that we have to stop the violence from both sides.
Well, Well, Robbie, tell us about this organization, the Parents Circle, because you've joined this organization, and it's a circle of bereaved parents of Palestinians and Israelis. And you meet how often?
Oh, all the time. Last night, you know, today is actually Memorial Day. And last night we had an alternate ceremony together with Combatants for Peace. And of course, many bereaved Israeli families were not too pleased with this. But some 3,000 people came last night. And I got some mails this morning that it was one of the most moving ceremonies. And there was a message from Desmond Tutu. And it's another way of looking. The pain is the same pain. No difference between a Palestinian and an Israeli who lost a child. I promise you, you go to sleep at night, the tears on the pillow that fall are the same color wherever, for all mothers.
There is some remarkable video of that meeting at the Parents Circle, because this is where, it was at the Parents Circle that you met this woman, Bushra Awad, who's now become a soul sister to you, correct?
Very
Let's
much
have a look
so.
at the video, because it's extraordinary that that was actually caught on camera.
Yes. And I want to thank you especially for coming,
تشكركي خاصة أنت على مجيئك.
because I know what is in your heart.
هي بتعرف بالضبط شو في قلبك.
How long ago did you lose your son?
قديش مستشفى؟ 3 years and a half.
3.5 years.
Like I told you.
And what was his name?
شو كان اسمه؟ محمود.
Mahmoud? You know, I will show you a picture of David. Yes?
فرجيكي صورة ديفيد.
So for why?
Hello.
Haram.
Hello.
What a wonderful moment. So now it's my honor to welcome Bushra Awad to this conversation.
شرف لإلي أرحب ببشرى عواد في المؤسسة.
Bushra lives outside Hebron, and like Robbie, she joined the Parents Circle as a bereaved parent and came to share its mission of peace in the region. And also with her is Tima Robi, who is Bushra's translator.
She needs to hear me better. We like
We're
to sit
destroying
close.
Closer. So now, Bushra, you should tell us now about your son. Tell us about Mahmoud.
احكي لنا عن ابنك عن محمود.
محمود كان شاب حلو.
محمود was very beautiful.
كان يدرس للامتحانات التوجيهي.
He was studying for his final exams at school.
كان شاطر بالمدرسة.
He was very good at school with good grades.
كان طموحه يكبر ويصير إشي منيح.
He wanted to be good in his community.
كان يحب يتعلم ويعلم أخوته.
He wanted to learn in college.
محمود كان أول فرحة في حياتي.
He was my first happiness.
أنا خلفته بعد 5 سنين من الجواز.
I gave birth to him after 5 years of getting married.
كان شمعة منورة في
He
داري.
was my candle, my lighted candle.
So how did you hear of his death, Bushra?
كيف سمعتي عن موته؟
أنا كنت بشتغل في البيت
I
وكان
was
يدرس.
cleaning my house.
كان يدرس. إحنا بيتنا صغير، غرفة فوق غرفة تحت.
We have a very small house made of 2 rooms, one upstairs and one downstairs.
هو كان يدرس في الغرفة اللي فوق وأنا
He was studying
بشتغل في البيت.
upstairs while I was doing the house chores.
صار مظاهرات في البلد.
شو؟
صار مظاهرة في
There
البلد.
was a demonstration outside.
قلت له محمود ما تطلعش من البيت.
I asked him not to leave the house.
خليك قاعد في البيت
Please
ادرس.
stay in and study.
قال لي ماشي يا أمي.
And he said, okay, I will.
بعد بشوي أنا كنت بشتغل في البيت، بعد بشوي أجاني محمود ومعاه أخوته الاثنين.
After a while, I saw Mahmoud coming into the house with his two brothers.
باقين برا في المظاهرة يعني.
It seems like his two brothers was out at the demonstration.
وهو جابهم عندي على البيت.
And he went out to get them back home.
قال لي تخليش إخوتي يطلعوا برا.
He didn't allow them to go to the demonstration.
قلت له ولا أنت كمان تطلع برا اقعد وادرس.
Sure.
قلت له ولا أنت كمان تطلع برا اقعدوا في البيت.
And she said, if you stop them from going out, you should stay in the house also.
قال لي ماشي تخافيش.
He said, okay, don't worry about me.
قلت له لا بدي أخاف عليك خليك
But
في
she
البيت.
said, no, I'm worried about you, please stay home.
بعد شوي هيك بشتغل أنا في البيت فجأة سمعت صوت رصاص قوي.
After a while I was working in the house, I heard shooting.
طلعت حوالي
I looked around me.
لقيت الأولاد في الدار بس محمود مش معهم.
I made sure that all of my kids are home, but Mahmoud wasn't there.
ناديت على أبوه.
I called his father
قلت له محمود مش في البيت.
and I told him that Mahmoud is not home.
اطلع دور عليه.
Please go out and look for him.
طلع أبوه يجري.
His father went out running,
تأخر ما أجاش.
but he didn't come back.
بعد شوي هيك أنا انفعلت.
After a while I was very
صرت
nervous.
أتصرف تصرفات مش داري عن حالي.
I wasn't sure what I'm supposed to do.
شوي أجا ابن جيراننا.
Then our neighbor's son came to my house
قال لي محمود تصاوب.
and he told me that Mahmoud was injured.
حكيت له محمود مات.
But I told him Mahmoud died.
طلعت من البيت أجري.
I started running from my house,
مش عارف وين بدي أروح.
but I didn't know where to go.
وأنا بأجري وقعت على الأرض.
While I was running, I fell down.
جاء أخويا قامني عن الأرض
Then my brother was next to me.
وأخذني على
Yeah.
المستشفى. قال لي محمود منيح.
My brother took me to the hospital and told me Mahmoud is fine, don't worry.
لما وصلت المستشفى
But when I arrived to the hospital,
لقيت أبوه قاعد باب المستشفى.
I found my husband sitting in front of the hospital
حامل كنترته
with his shoes in his hand,
وأضرب على راسه
hitting himself in the head
وبقول لي محمود راح
and telling me Mahmoud is gone.
راح.
He's gone.
Well, when you heard that news, Bushra, this devastating, tragic news,
اللي سمعتي بوشرا
was your
إشي
first
بهدل.
feelings of beyond pain? Was your first feeling anger? Did you feel
شو
revenge
كان
for the other
أول
side?
شعور حسيتي؟ هل كان انتقام، غضب، شو حسيتي؟
ما كانش في عندي أي شعور إلا إني ولد من أولادي راح فقدته يعني ما
I didn't have any feeling. I just lost one of my kids.
شيء مني راح.
Like I lost a part of me.
زي ما حكيت محمود كان شمعة في داري مضوية.
As I said,
انطفت.
Mahmoud was my candle in the house and it got turned off.
Bushra, how did you go from this terrible bereavement to wanting to join the parent
كيف
circle?
انتقلتي من هذا الفقدان القاسي وانضميتي للمنتدى؟
أنا طلعت حوالي قلت إذا بدي أضل هيك يمكن أعود أفقد أي ولد من أولادي.
Because I looked around me and I said, if I'll be staying at my house, maybe I'll lose another one of my children.
تعرفت على روبي.
Then I met Robbie.
قلت مش
And what did
غلط.
you think of Robbie when you first met Robbie?
شو فكرتي عن روبي أول مرة التقيتي فيها؟
لا بعدت عنها كشيت عنها.
I didn't like her.
You like me?
She didn't.
And how did you become changed? What changed about that?
وكيف
that you
الإشي
started
تغير؟
liking?
كيف غيرتي رأيك عنها؟
روبي أنا حبيتها كتير لأن وجعها كان من وجعي.
I love Robi very much. After I know that her pain is my pain.
ما حكت لي قصتها وأنا حكيت قصتي إلها.
After she told me her story and her son's story,
روبي وأنا
I recognized that she's a mother and I'm a
Robi.
mother also.
فقدت ابنها وأنا فقدت ابني.
Robbie lost her son and I also
وجعنا
lost my son.
وجعنا واحد ومشترك.
We have the same pain.
And what does the rest of your community feel about you being a friend of Robbie and joining the circle with the Israeli parents?
شو مجتمعك بحس أو بفكر عنك عشان أنت انضميتي للمنتدى وإنك صديقة لروبي؟
المجتمع يعني في إشي متقبل وفي إشي لا.
Some of the people in my community accept that and some of them don't.
تعرضت لحكي كتير يعني إني أنا ببيع في دم ابني.
Some of the people say to me that I'm selling my son's blood.
لكن أنا ما ببيع في دم ابني، أنا
But I'm not.
بشتري في دم أولادي.
I'm buying the blood of my other kids.
The Parents Circle is an extraordinary organization, and you have done an incredibly effective, I think, PSA, which I'd like to run now because it has enormous power. Let's see it now.
אנחנו לא רוצים אתכם.
אנחנו לא רוצים אתכם פה.
لا نريدكم هنا.
לא רוצים אתכם פה.
لا نريدكم هنا. لا نريدكم هنا.
لا نريدكم هنا. אנחנו לא רוצים אתכם פה.
لا نريدكم هنا.
لا نريدكم هنا. עופו מפה. אנחנו לא רוצים אתכם פה.
אנחנו לא רוצים אתכם פה.
Robbie, tell us a little of the work of the Parents Circle, because you're really doing very sort of, you're doing a lot of projects together, aren't you, in terms of recreating histories?
Well, if you may have noticed, the three of us are wearing some strange-looking shoes.
بحكي لهم إذا أنتوا الثلاثة بتشوفوا.
You may have noticed a bird, Bushra.
غريبات. شايفين
This is a symbol of walk the walk and walk the talk and take steps. And it's a way, you know, I traveled a lot around the West Bank and discovered that women have no income. And when they make embroidery, they don't have the tools to make things that are fashionable. They don't have the threads, they don't have the materials. And the work is so difficult, and they get no money, and people pity buy. And I think that's the worst thing that you can possibly do. And so we went to the fashion school in Tel Aviv, Shenkar, and we had a whole embroidery workshop where the Palestinian women taught the students, also students from London, how to embroider. And they came back with all kinds of ideas. Their ideas were too fancy, and our ideas were much better because we decided that we want to make shoes so that every woman who goes out to demonstrate will have these shoes. And we wanted to become a worldwide phenomena on the 8th of March, which is International Women's Day, that women all over the world will wear these shoes and say why, against all kinds of conflict, but also to tell the story of Bushra or of me or of any of the mothers in our group. We aren't just two strangers coming out of Israel and Palestine. There are so many more like us. There is Nasra, who lost 2 sons, Ahmad, who lost 2 brothers. There is Iris Segev, who lost her son. All of this is such a binding way of work. We have a book here. Of course, you're allowing me to do all this advertising. Thank you.
That's what it's about. We're selling these shoes in the boutique, right?
We're going to, not yet.
Okay, well, we have to do that.
We have to bring the shoes. We have to raise the money to buy 1,000 pairs of shoes from China. And we have...
Hear that?
Because otherwise Converse will put me in jail one of these days. But we also have a cookbook here which is a beautiful, it's nothing to do with cooking. I mean, the jam recipes are great. It's called Jam Session. But it was a way for us to tell the story of all the mothers and sisters who'd lost children, and also to understand their culture and where they came from. And Bushra's a pretty good cook. I must say the Israelis cannot match the Palestinian cooking, but you could try my marmalade.
You know, very few people, I think, know what it's like to live in the occupied territories. And I thought it would be interesting here for people to hear how difficult, I gather, and I've heard, your life is day to day, your daily life in the occupied territories. What sort of obstacles do you face for your daily life living there?
أنا حياتي بعد ما فقدت محمود، بعد ما انقتل محمود صارت صعبة كتير.
After I lost Mahmoud, my life became more difficult.
محمود كان يساعد أبوه في الشغل.
Mahmoud used to help his father at work.
كانوا يشتغل جوز دهان.
They were working in painting houses.
كان محمود يساعده.
Mahmoud used to help his father at work.
وأنا حياتي صارت أصعب لما جوزي صار معه حادث.
But my life got harder and harder after my husband has an accident.
فقد نص رجله فيها.
He lost half of his leg in that accident.
صرت أتعرض يعني للصعوبات في الحياة أكثر. صار كل شيء مطلوب مني، بطل جوزي يشتغل زي أول.
So everything around the house, mostly I must do it.
عندي 7 أولاد هسه.
I have 7 kids.
أنا حياتي صعبة صارت كتير يعني من كل النواحي، مع أولادي، مع جيراني، مع حياتي.
My life is difficult with my kids, with my neighbors.
Robbie, I know that you were deeply moved by some of the things you learnt in the parent circle about the Palestinian way of life that you didn't know before.
Well, I had always been active with the Palestinian Israeli citizens, but not over in the West Bank. And when I discovered the difficulties of a daily life, of when I looked at Bushra and she came to Tel Aviv, firstly, she donated blood together with me, which was an amazing act because many of her neighbors said, "What are you doing this for?" And she said, "I'm doing it to protect my other children." And she hadn't been to the sea since she was 9. And so I said, "Okay, take off all the stuff, we're going to the beach." And we went to the beach, and she was jumping in the water like a little child. And I thought, how privileged we are. Her children can't go to the beach. They need to get permission. It breaks my heart sometimes because we run a summer camp. And I ask the children, what is it you would want? And they say, we want to go somewhere where there's the sea and we want to see an elephant. And I think to myself, my grandchildren, all I need to do, they just phone me up and say, Safta, let's do something, and that's what we do. And there's no freedom of movement. And freedom of movement is a basic human right. And Israel will have to get out. Israel will have to get out of the occupied territories because otherwise we will never be free. But I wanted to say that not only for the sake of the Palestinians. I'm Israeli, I love my country, but I want to live in a moral country, and we cannot be moral by occupying another country for so many years.
Tell me, is there any chance that the mothers and parents of the bereaved that you are, is there any chance that you could come into the a formal peace process? Because the kind of emotional connection that you are forging is so clearly the only thing that's going to bridge this divide. Is there any way that you can become politically of use in this process?
Well, what we are doing now is, the long-term goal of the organization is to create a framework for a reconciliation process to become an integral part of any future peace agreement, because otherwise we'll just have another ceasefire until the next time. And so we're working on that both with academics and lawyers, people who can help us, We are the ants on the ground. You know, many people think that it was only Mandela, but it wasn't. There were ants on the ground for many years before who created this framework for a reconciliation. And we have to have that. We've stood on the White House lawns before. We've signed papers. We've hugged each other and ate hummus. But it didn't mean anything. Now is the time when we have to have a reconciliation process. I know it sounds strange now, but if we don't have that hope, and now more than ever, this world has to support the peace movements on the ground on both sides. We need you.
Well, since the Netanyahu re-election, what is the atmosphere of the idea of reconciliation?
We will continue to work. If Bushra and I can sit in this room and speak in the same voice and feel this understanding of the shared pain, then surely that should be an example for everybody else.
So Bushra and Robbie, each of you, is there anything you would like to say to people here? Any thought you would like to leave us with today?
When you go away tonight, remember that our lives are totally intertwined. And what will happen to Bushra and me will affect you. And what we do will also affect you. And what you will do will affect us. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Robbie. Bushra, is there a last word from Bushra?
أنا بتمنى إنه ولا أم تفقد ابنها أكثر. أنا فقدت ابني وبتمنى ولا أم تقدر تفقد ابنها، لا فلسطينية ولا مسلمة ولا مسيحية ولا يهودية ولا أي حدا في الدنيا اللي خلق.
I hope that no other woman loses her son, not a Jew, not a Palestinian, not a Christian, not a Muslim, no one.
إن فقدان الابن وجع كبير.
Because losing our sons is a huge pain.
جرح في القلب عمره ما
It's a hurt in the heart that never heals.
Robbie, Bushra, Tima. These are some of the most inspiring women I have ever met on this stage or anywhere else.